What's good, everybody? It's your boy, the real AG, back at you on the Lockdown Defense Sports Network. And as y'all know, we are in the thick of our off-season review, preview as we approach the draft quite literally a month out at this point. So things are ramping up. If you caught up with our content up to now, you know we reviewed every division in the AFC last week, looking at the teams, moves they made, team remaining needs, best available options through free agency and draft. We kicked off this week at the NFC with the NFC East. My boy Coach Defense breaking it down here on this Wednesday. We're going to head up to the North, and winter is coming for my thronies out there. But we're going to look at the NFC North again, just the team or the moves they've made up to free agency thus far, key additions, key departures, what are the remaining needs, and what are some options out there, either through free agency or the draft or a little bit of both. But getting right into it, we'll start with, that's kind of what we're reviewing, but getting right into it, we're going to start with the Chicago Bears, the perennial division champs, the surprise team of 2025, and one that's has a lot of hype around them, and one that a lot of teams are picking to do some real damage here in this year. So all these moves matter, and it's all going to culminate with the draft and how things will progress. But here's what they've done so far. Obviously traded for Garrett Bradbury with the Patriots. That was a pretty quick move after the surprise retirement of Dahlman. They signed Kobe Bryant from the Seahawks. They signed Devin Bush. They signed Neville Gallimore. They re-signed DeMarco Jackson. They signed Khalif Raymond from Detroit. Big shocker that Ben Johnson wanted to bring him into the fold. They re-signed offensive tackle Braxton Jones. They signed Jedrick Wills, who, promising first-round pick with Cleveland, took a year off, but I think that's a kind of a sneaky addition for a team that's, needed some O-line stability. Really, I think the biggest additions, looking at this have to be, Devin Bush and Kobe Bryant, as well as Gallimore and Khalif Raymond, just because those guys, at least definitely Raymond's going to contribute on special teams, and Gallimore just gives them some good depth in the middle of their defense. But they also had a lot of, big departures or releases. Again, I mentioned Drew Dahlman retired, traded DJ Moore to Buffalo, lost a pair of their, long-standing safeties, with Bayard going back to his boy Vrabel with the Pats, Jaquan Brisker going to the Steelers. They released Tremaine Edmonds. He went to the Giants. They lost, two corners as well. Jonathan Owens and Nashawn Wright both went to the Jets. Jets, like I said, trying to do everything they can to get a pick next year. But key departures nonetheless for the Bears. Like I said, Bryant, Bush, and Bradbury are, I think, the best signings. Trading for Bradbury was absolutely huge, after that surprise retirement. I mentioned, those guys as the surefire, sure things. I think the rest of them are, quality depth, and then, some semi-unknown commodities. But I think it was pretty apparent, just looking at these moves, that Chicago wanted to get a little bit younger and faster on the defensive side of the ball. And I think they ultimately accomplished that goal, for the most part, with the guys that they've signed thus far. Now, getting into, the work that still needs to be done, the three remaining positions in need, in my opinion, for the Bears, that is edge rusher, someone opposite of Sweat. They need a safety, and they need cornerback, all which I think at this point is probably going to be addressed for the most part through the draft. Looking at their upcoming picks, and let's not forget that Chicago was very much in on the Max Crosby trade debacle. They almost landed him, but ultimately decided to, keep their picks. So I think that's kind of the writings on the wall of what they are wanting to do to fill these positions in need. But they do have, first-round pick 25, 2 second-rounders, a third, fourth, and 2 sevenths. So they got a lot of ammunition in the draft to make some moves. But we'll see what happens. But for the, ideal free agent or draft pick that would fit some of these needs. I think that Trevon Diggs is one that they could add via free agency, a little cheaper and younger than the two other, big options at cornerback that are still out there with Lattimore and Snead. Albeit I will admit Lattimore, Snead, and Diggs all are not really surefire options, in my opinion. Carry a little bit of, risk with it. But I think Chicago ultimately is going to add a bargain bin cube or cornerback, if you will, to be opposite of Stevenson now and then target a corner later in this draft, since it is such a stacked class, in that position. Other guys moving into more of that draft realm, I got Keldrick Falk, the D end out of Auburn. I think this is, like I said, they were in on Max Crosby. They didn't get Max Crosby. They haven't really signed anyone else, and there's nothing out there that, it rings the bell on this being accomplished, filling the need. So I think they are 100% addressing edge rusher at pick 25, and or maybe even moving up if a guy that they really, really want seems that he might go before 25. But Keldrick Folk, I think, is a guy that would be in that 25 range. Fitz, I think, has the skill set that they would need, and I think just the raw tangibles to be an effective or even maybe elite edge rusher, and especially a good running mate opposite of Sweat in Chicago. He has a 6'6" frame, positional versatility, and is also a very stout run defender. So almost a complete guy off the edge that they would, again, be getting younger and faster at that position. And, I think a guy they ultimately should target. Next guy on here, we got our man Tredain Stukes. Shout out Mike Dubb. He noted him very early in this whole process, but he's kind of a hybrid cornerback safety out of Arizona. He is effective against the run game. If you watch his film, he had almost 30 tackles on design run plays, out of that safety spot for Arizona. And he's very productive in coverage as well. He had 4 picks. He is, a little bit on the older side. He's 26, but, as a former walk-on to perennial starter for Arizona, I think he would be a useful addition to this team that, certainly needs to bolster the secondary and get a boost in that safety spot more than anything. But that's the Chicago Bears. We will now move on to the next NFC team, the Detroit Lions. Those pesky, put their hard hat on, steel mill Lions up in Detroit. Kind of been a little quiet and honestly not a whole lot of great stuff to, go singing home about on what they've done thus far. You see the moves there. I think the biggest additions they've made thus far are Cade Mays, the center, Isaiah Pacheco, the running back, former Kansas City Chief. Shout out Pop. Juice Scruggs, the guy they got in the trade for David Montgomery, which again was almost basically essentially 5th round value. And they also had added, I think about 2 days ago, added Peyton Turner, another former 1st round pick D end. Key departures for Detroit. I think that's, the bigger thing. That's kind of been the thing with them these last couple of years, has been more big departures than big additions, but obviously traded David Montgomery. So lost the knuckles to Sonic, if you will. I'm kind of laughing to myself about what some people call Pacheco, but if you know, you know. They also lost Azalone, the linebacker. I think he went to Miami. They lost Khalif Raymond, like I noticed, talking about the Bears, and they, released 2 linemen in Taylor Decker, longtime left tackle for them, and Graham Glasgow. I think overall the Lions had a very what I would call initial wave of free agency. They addressed their needs on the O-line and at running back, and even getting a backup QB brought Teddy Bridgewater back, but none of them are very exciting / game-changing moves, in my opinion. But I think that was kind of to be expected, because Detroit under this regime has always been, a team that prioritizes drafting and developing. And I don't think that sentiment, obviously that sentiment has not changed what they've done thus far. So on for the biggest needs remaining, I have, again, edge rusher. They need that running mate that they've been desperately trying to find to pair with Hutchinson. They got to figure out what they're doing at left tackle. and they need a strong side linebacker for losing Azalone in free agency. So that's kind of, the three areas. Again, I think that they're relatively done in free agency. I did note one free agent, but I think this is mostly done in the draft at this point. They got the number 17 pick. They got a second round pick, 2 4s, 2 5s, and 2 6. So, some moves will be made nonetheless. But what I think are some ideal additions with those needs in mind. First and foremost, I got Cameron Jordan, the D end from the longtime D end with the Saints, release pending free agent. I think it's just kind of a deal that really makes sense because you look at what Cameron Jordan can bring. I mean, at some point, Father Time's going to catch up, but he hasn't had a lot of huge injury concerns lately. I mean, proven veteran that can be, I think had on a 1-year deal, would sort of be what I would call the flex seal fix to give them that running mate to a Hayden Hutchinson, but probably just for 1 year. But again, like I said, almost a perfect pairing because Detroit's defensive schemes and approaches are based on, Dennis Allen's philosophies on that side of the ball. And I mean, like, we know how Cam Jordan was, albeit younger Cam Jordan, but we know how he was in a Dennis Allen system. So it could be a very under the radar, effective signing for Detroit, trying to keep that championship window open. The other two needs here, I think, are addressed in the draft. Like I said, they got to figure out who their left tackle is. I got Monroe Freeling. A lot of people are popular on this one, but I think this is the guy that although somewhat inexperienced, he only started in 17 games. I think it's a guy that has all the tools to be the other offensive tackle of the future for Detroit with Penei Sewell over there. But Freeling is, a bona fide mauler in the run game, and I think is, still young and raw in his pass protection game, and I think just tapping into that potential. So, that's a guy I think they target, and I think they target this pretty early in the draft as well. And then, filling in that linebacker need, I got Jacob Rodriguez, a linebacker out of Texas Tech, and I got to be honest with y'all, like, this just, seems like a Dan Campbell guy to me. I don't know what it is, but Jacob Rodriguez just screams Dan Campbell. You got with Rodriguez himself, you got an uber athletic linebacker that I think would fill in nicely with, Jack Campbell and the other Rodriguez in Detroit. So we'd have the Bash Bros, the Rodriguez Bash Bros if this happened. But, Jacob from Texas Tech has, also just looking at his film, you could see he has, that elite production with tackles, picks, forced fumbles. Like, the dude just has a nose for the football. That's what you want in a strong side linebacker, or just replacing a big loss at linebacker. That's the type of guy you want to fill that role with. So that's the Detroit Lions, kind of where they're at and where I think they're going. Moving on to the next team, we got those Acme pesky Green Bay Packers up in Wisconsin and, what they're doing. And to be honest, they didn't do a whole lot. They lost a lot of big pieces, but I think that was somewhat to be expected, with just some moves they made. Looking at the big additions here, obviously signed Javon Hargrave, D tackle from Minnesota, traded for Zaire Franklin, signed Sejuiced from the Chargers. I'm sure my boy Coach and RG are kind of happy about that one. And, signed Sky Moore from the 49ers. Bigger departures, kind of like with Detroit, a lot more of big-time departures and additions. But obviously lost Quay Walker to free agency, lost Romeo Dobbs, lost Malik Willis, let Rasheed Walker, go. Their starting left tackle, let him walk. Released Elton Jenkins, their starting guard and center. Traded Rashawn Gary and let Kingsley Enagbare walk as well in free agency. So, a lot more losses than additions, but I think that was always going to be the case with Green Bay this year. They still have a lot of needs that are going to have to be addressed before the start of 2026, in my opinion. If I had to grade what they've done thus far, I'd give it a D, but, it was kind of to be expected that they'd be sort of quiet because they kind of had to, they took on a lot of financial hardships and draft capital hardships to acquire Michael Parsons, and they were going to need to do things to kind of right that ship and keep things moving. So, that's where the Packers are at right now through this initial wave of free agency. This is where things are at. What are the remaining positions in need, in my opinion? Well, I got offensive line. Just kind of across the board, it's just a very sketchy projected starting five, if you ask me, outside of a couple guys. But they're currently looking at a starting rotation of Tom, Belton, Ryan, Banks, and Morgan. And some of those guys, I'm like, I don't know that I'd be confident in that. They need kind of more edge rushing, D-line depth, and they need cornerback help. So, what do I think they do, or what are some ideal fits with that? We kind of same vein. I picked one free agency approach, and two through the draft. But I think they're going to have to do free agency to address some needs because, again, like I said, traded for Michael Parsons. They do not have a first round pick this year. They are first picking at number 52 in the second round. Then they had a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and 2/7. So, something's going to have to be addressed still through free agency. With that, I think just to help kind of shore up some of the offensive line woes, if you will, I got Mekhi Becton, the free agent offensive guard / offensive tackle. I'm going to call him that. That was released by the Chargers. I mean, we really can't deny it. Like, he did have just a terrible season with the Chargers, but before that, had a solid year in Philly and, was decently fine with the Jets. Like, at this point, a lot of people just suck for the Jets mostly. But, I think offensive lineman that's available. He has, like I said, that versatility and experience of playing both guard and tackle. And I think if he's willing to sign another prove it type deal, they might be able to kind of shore up some of that stability for their offensive line for 2026 and potentially beyond. But I'm not going to act like that's going to has a lot of possibility or traction with it. But and if it doesn't work out at the worst case, then they have some solid depth at tackle and guard, on the cheap. But I think Mekhi Becton's a guy they should definitely target to shore up the O line a little bit. Moving to the draft, addressing that edge rush, I got Gabe Lucas, the defensive end out of Illinois. They did remove on from Gary. They got Micah Parsons mending from an injury, and then they got Lucas Van Ness from Iowa, who they took a few years back. And I think the writing's on the wall that they expect or hope he'll take a big step forward. But if I was a Packers fan, I would not be holding my breath for that to happen. I think just even if him with Van Ness being there, losing Rashawn Gary automatically necessitates the need for the Packers to address edge rusher pretty early in the draft. That's where my man Gabe Lucas comes in. Just looking at Gabe Lucas, he is a high energy type pass rusher. Just, a guy, I guess they say, have a high motor. A lot of his, work off the edge. I put it similar to like Karloff. It just looks like a hustle type player, but he does have a well-developed, well-polished arsenal of moves and pass rush skills. And looking at his past two seasons in Illinois, he had 19 tackles and 6 forced fumbles. And I think could really be a steal in the second round for the Packers if he is there. Second guy I got for them addressing the need, we got our man D'Angelo Pons. Sorry, I always just want to say Pounds. Our man D'Angelo Pons, from the corner from Indiana, national championship Hoosiers, I should add. But, he is probably the best, if not one of the best, nickel corners that's in this draft. He is definitely undersized. That's why we don't call him Pounds. We call him Pons. But he does have, looking at his tape, you can see that he has elite quickness. He has instincts in that nickel slot role, and he has explosiveness out of that spot. Those are all traits you want in needing, that position on the defense, and just to bring someone in and know they've got the skill set to get things done. So I think Pons would be an awesome prospect that they could really throw in that nickel slot spot right away, for the new DC and Jonathan Gannon. But that is the Green Bay Packers. We're going to wrap things up with the NFC North, looking at those Minnesota Vikings and, what they've been doing. And similar to the Packers, they've been pretty quiet, but that's because they kind of had to write some financial hardships. Looking at the big additions there, I think the biggest signings are obviously, bringing in Kyler Murray, released from the Cardinals, brought in on a 1-year deal, and then they brought in James Pierre, the corner, on a free agency deal as well. Big departures for them. They again more bigger departures for a lot of the NFC North teams than additions, in my opinion. But they lost Jonathan Allen, lost Javon Hargrave. They lost Jalen Naylor. Ryan Kelly, their center, retired. And, they had released franchise cornerstone in Harrison Smith while he decides if he wants to play or not. The reports on that seem kind of weird, but either way, long-time safety, again, franchise cornerstone, not on the team in Harrison Smith. But I think I would say, I guess, that just looking at what they needed the most, I think it was a decent free agency period for the Vikings because they got, like I said, the one thing that they needed, and that was a viable, secondary option at quarterback to, one, compete and push J.J. McCarthy, or, take his spot, which is, if you catch up with more Hit Squad and Lockdown Defense content, you'll know how the boys feel about that. But that they got the most exciting available QB to fill that big area of need after how 2025 went. I think Pierre gives them some, much needed corner depth, but there's still a lot of work to be done because they did not address, a lot of big needs. They have more than three, in my opinion, but some of them just really can't be addressed because, again, they had to correct their finances first. But what do I think are the top three positions of need left after where we're at through the first wave for the Vikings? I got D tackle. I think that's pretty obvious. It's the top priority and biggest need after losing players like Jonathan Allen and Javon Hargrave. Again, I got safety. You need to find a long-term starter if Harrison Smith is not coming back. And to be honest, they need to do it anyways because if he comes back, it's going to be for 1 year. And then, they need to find a center or just some option to replace Ryan Kelly. Looking at the draft itself, they do have 9 picks. They got number 18 in the first round, a second rounder, 2/3, fifth, sixth, and seventh. So, again, they also have a lot of ammunition to, make some moves in this draft. But what do I think are the best fits or ideal moves for them to make? Number one, I got them taking Dylan Thieneman, the safety from Oregon. Again, whether Harrison Smith comes back or not, like I said, they're going to need to find their guy for the future and the heir apparent, if you will. And they need to find someone who is, one, younger and would bring, similar abilities to what a prime Harrison Smith gave the Minnesota Vikings throughout his career. And that is just a guy that, a safety that can limit the explosive plays downfield, be a downfield player against the run and, cover well in the slot. And I think that Dylan T brings all of those things, to the fold. He had 6 picks as a true freshman at Purdue, went to finish his career at Oregon and, obviously did pretty solid. Had a killer dominant combine performance that was capped off with the 4.3 40, and I think is, a surefire pick for the Vikings for that successor at safety. Looking at kind of shoring up that center spot, I got Lloyd Cushenberry, pending free agent. He's been a center with the Broncos and the Titans. He's one of the younger options that's still available. It's really him or James Daniel. And if I'm Minnesota and you are kind of in as, and I'm Kevin O'Connell and I'm in this I got to win now mode, I'd rather get someone who has starting experience to fill that safety spot than to bring in someone in the 3rd round or 2nd round or later and say, you're the guy. Like, that's just, it's not going to bode well for anyone, let alone the quarterback, but just the whole team. And I think that it's just not the way to go. So Lloyd Cushenberry is my, quality starter fix for them to address Ryan Kelly retiring. And then to round things out, I got Lee Hunter, the D tackle out of Texas Tech. Overall, I call him in the caveman analysis, big guy that moved like little guy. But he is just a dominant, like a big just dominating defensive tackle type, 318-pound interior D lineman, 6'9" wingspan, has a very violent and upfield first step, which is, definitely what you want in an interior D lineman. And I think is way more agile than you would expect when you watch his film for someone who has the kind of height and weight that he carries. Hunter might be gone by the time that their second round pick comes up, but I don't know who else they would put on the card if he's there when their name is called in the second round. But that wraps up kind of the Minnesota Vikings, where they're at, what they need to do, and who I think they should target, as well as, the whole NFC North review of free agency and preview for things moving forward. As always, for our fans, please hit that subscribe button so you do not miss out on the rest of the content we're dropping through this offseason and onward and upward throughout the rest of the NFL year and beyond. As always, like the video, please, if you enjoyed this content and want to get it out to other people. If you are a fan of one of these teams or just a fan of the offseason and want to put your GM hat on, let me hear from you in the comments. If you agree with the positions of need I noted, with the moves I've kind of picked for these teams. If you disagree, we want to hear from you. As always, as well, please be on the lookout or check out our Patreon channel that just dropped a few weeks ago, where we are dropping exclusive, spicy, unfiltered content covering not just our NFL teams, but the league as a whole, pressing issues through the league. And we got a lot of exciting things lined up with there. If you want to get at me, there's my social info right there in the middle of the page, as well as the rest of the hit squad. If you're looking for other lockdown defense content, bam, there's everything and everywhere that we are at on social media. So get at us. But in the meantime, in between time, I'm the real AG. This was the NFC. I keep wanting to say AFC. This is the NFC North preview and review. Please be on the lookout for the NFC West and the NFC South videos coming out later this week. But in the meantime, in between time, I'll see y'all. Peace.